places where like they grill the chicken right there, you know, and they've got like the cilantro rice and they've got the beans and they've got all kinds of stuff. So you get in line and there's like 4 different tortillas to choose from, and they're like gluten-free, wheat, spinach, or I don't know, just flour. Do you want kidney beans, pinto beans, navy beans, black beans, but refried beans, like black beans? And then it's like people in line are all pushing through, and you're getting kind of nervous, right? And you're also getting kind of nervous because the burrito's getting bigger and bigger. You're like, how are they going to get that in the tortilla, right? So they're getting close to the end of the line, and then they have this massive thing, you know, they actually put all that stuff, like 4 pounds of stuff inside the burrito, and then they give it to you, and you're like, like, I love this, right? So is that one of those places? Maybe you've been to one of those too. Okay, so I'm getting in line, and when you go places dressed like this, interesting things happen to you. So there I am, singing. Just kidding, I wasn't. And so I was a hungry nun, and hungry nuns are not always fun to be around. So anyway, so I'm hungry, and I'm thinking, and there's this young guy, he's about 20, and he's grilling chicken, and he's looking right at me, and I see him go, interesting. And he looks at me, and he's like, you a nun? And I said, yes, I am. And he's like, can you see through me? And I said, no, I'm sorry, I can't. And he's like, don't you have any superpowers or anything? You know, and he's like grilling chicken, clearly disappointed that he's waited his whole life to meet a nun, and he meets the only one that's not super nun, right? So he's turning the chicken over, and I said, I just try to love Jesus as much as I can, and I bring joy wherever I go. And he's like, and so he just kind of starts turning the chicken over. And I'm feeling bad for this guy. I'm like, okay, I tell you what, I'll pray for you, right? And his coworker's like, oh, girl, he needs that. Mm-hmm. And I said, so I said, yeah, I'll pray for you. And he's like, oh, sister, will you pray I become a millionaire? And I said, tell you what, and this just came out of my mouth. I'm like, how about I pray that you get to heaven? How about that? And he's like, okay. And he just goes back to turning his chicken over, you know? And I just laughed, and I sat there and ate my 12-pound burrito, and it all went right here. And I just was watching him, and I'm like, that's so what we do to God, right? It's been said that our idea of God is not too big. It is far too small. And so often in our life, we ask God for things, and we think these things are going to make us happy, and we're really looking for something limitless. And we ask God for something, in a sense, kind of like $1 million, and he's like, how about eternal life? And we're like, go back to turn the chicken over, right? Because we long for something more. Or have you ever done this? Have you ever done like the Twitter, Instagram night thing before you go to bed? Okay. So you're sitting there, you're laying there, whatever, you're reclining at table. And so I'm going to pull up my Twitter feed right here. So you're pulling up your Instagram feed or whatever, and you just start scrolling through. Have you ever done that? You start scrolling through it, and you're like, oh man, she lost weight. What filter is that? And she looks good. And you start looking through it, and you go, oh, yeah, his dad bought him another truck. His dad don't know he was drunk when he crashed the first one, but I know that, right? So you start going through, and then all of a sudden you're looking, and you're looking, and you're looking, and you're looking at everybody else's feed, and all of a sudden you're like, man, I think I've got the lamest life ever on planet Earth, you know? You start comparing your life, but you just can't, you can't stop. Have you ever done that? You just cannot stop. And you're like, no, I mean it this time. And then you pick it back up, and you're like, no, and you refresh your feed, and you just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And you're looking for something more, and then somebody likes your Instagram photo, or they retweet your stuff, and for a moment you have this passing kind of moment of satisfaction. And then you're hungry again, right? Looking for something more. I think sometimes we think, well, there must be something wrong with me because this doesn't satisfy me. I don't know, it seems to satisfy everybody else. And the truth is, it doesn't fully satisfy because it's not meant to, because it's passing and we're made for eternity. Yes? Okay. So enter the limitless one. If you saw the movie Passion of the Christ, it's a still shot from that movie. It's kind of intense, yeah? A little intense. Mel Gibson said when he directed that movie, when they were studying the crucifixion scene, they actually, if you can imagine this, the last time you saw it, if you think about that scene, and this is the picture that you see is actually when he falls, when his mom sees him fall. And she has a flashback of when he fell as a little boy. And she just takes off running for him. But see, this time she can't pick him up. And as he lays on the ground there, just covered in blood and just marred and beaten, and he says, in the movie, Mel Gibson has him say, I make all things new. I make all things new. Mel Gibson said that he actually, after studying the crucifixion and studying how Romans tortured people, he said he actually had to tone down the violence for the crucifixion scene. Can you imagine that? He said everybody in our minds, we have a psychological trauma point where we experience so much trauma we just can't handle it anymore, so we just stop. So he said what he had everybody do in his movie, he actually took you to the brink right before your mind just kind of shut down because the trauma was too much. And he just let you hang there so you could kind of see what that's like. And Jesus says that in the Gospel of John. He says, I will lay down my life for my sheep. And so often we had this kind of sensitized or kind of desensitized, kind of just sanitized version of Christ. And here's a man who lays down his life for his sheep. Complete, limitless love, holding nothing back. That man is afraid of nothing. Absolutely nothing. I remember hearing a talk on suffering one time, and the speaker said that in antiquity, times of antiquity, when sheep owners were looking for a shepherd to watch over their flock, they would choose the shepherds that had the most scars on their hands and their arms, because they knew that those men had gone to battle and that they would protect what was given to them. And so they would choose those men to lay down their life, the shepherd with the most scars. And so often we have a very interesting idea of love, right? Love is, whatever we feel strongly about or whatever I feel particularly attracted to. And we say, I love that. And maybe we're affectionate for it. But Pope Benedict, in his encyclical on God is Love, he says, it is this man here, the pierced one hanging there with the blood and water dripping from his side. He said, this is where love begins. And how God reveals his love for us, and he reveals his destiny for us and his plan for us, not through nice words or nice feelings or just glorious moments, but through immense suffering. And I think throughout generations, really that's been the trouble, the problem of pain that troubles us the most, believers and non-believers alike. When we speak of suffering, we can't really quite understand it. And oftentimes in our minds and our lives, we say, why is this happening to me? Why did this have to happen? Why did my parents have to divorce? Why did that person have to die? Why is there so much evil in the world? If God is so good, if he's good all the time, if God is real, well, then why is there so much evil? Why is there so much suffering? Any Pope Francis fans in the house? Anybody like Pope Francis at all? Yeah. So you might know that last January, Pope Francis went to the Philippines. Yeah, amen. And part of his stay there, part of his trip, he actually met with Filipino street children. And the little boy and the little girl that you see in the photo is an actual photo of two of the kids that presented to him. And he heard from 4 children that day. And the second to the last child was a boy, and he was telling Pope Francis of how he was 14 years old, and he was on the streets by himself fending for his life, and he would eat out of the trash can, and how they would try to escape at night from people that were preying upon them, would try to sell them into prostitution and slavery and things like that. But the last child to speak is that precious little girl that you see, and she's 12. And she stood up in front of Pope Francis and all these cardinals and all these dignitaries, and she began to tell her story. And she said, Holy Father, sometimes people suffer at the hands of their own parents. Her mom and dad were too poor, and so they left her to herself. They sent her to the streets, and they didn't take her back. And she was telling him how she too had to fight to get food out of the trash can, and how she was so afraid for herself, especially at night. She wasn't sure what was going to happen. And then she just began to cry. And she said to Pope Francis, she said, why did God allow this to happen to us? And then she said, how come there are so few people that will help us? And Pope Francis watched that little girl, and he had a speech all prepared. That he sat down, and he looked around, and he looked at that beautiful little girl, and he said, this little girl is the only one to ask the question to which there is no answer. And he said, sometimes the only answer we can give is tears. And he stood up and he hugged her, and she wept on his heart. Suffering is very mysterious, isn't it? And the answer that God gives us ultimately is the answer that we're all longing for. The answer of the one who takes on our sin, who takes on all that breaks us, all of our loneliness and all of our isolation. He takes it upon himself, and he suffers for us, the innocent one, where he hears our cries and he sees our pain. And it is his desire to welcome us into that embrace, this tender embrace. But to be embraced requires us to be vulnerable. C.S. Lewis, in his very famous book, The Four Loves, he says that to love at all is to be vulnerable. And if you're like me in your life, you've probably been hurt a bit, and it's a huge risk to love. It's a huge risk to be stripped naked and to be demeaned and to be mocked and to be scourged and to still give your heart. Dr. Tom Neal is a professor at Notre Dame Seminary in New Orleans, Louisiana, and he had this beautiful post on suffering, and he says this, he says, "In a world where God's mercy is absent, people either live in a perpetual cycle of shame and guilt, hurt and anger, resentment and unforgiveness, or they rationalize away their sins, dismantle the truth of God's commandments, and create a new moral order wherein mercy is unnecessary because all is permitted." Sound familiar? It is the fear we have a lot of times of facing ourselves, of facing our brokenness, of facing this fierce intimacy of God who desires to receive us, that we push it away. But Dr. Tom Neal finishes it by saying, "But we who have faith in Jesus' cross have no problem facing our broken lives as broken, in need of repair." And I was telling the ladies this morning that I used to work at a daycare. I worked at a daycare for children for 8 years, and I have all kinds of daycare stories. And I love little kids. Have you ever had a little kid tell you the truth? They rip your face off, and they're like, "You're so cute." And I'm like, "It just hurts," right? So little kids make you more human. And those children made me more human. And in our school, we had the school and we had the parish, and then across the street is kind of an afterthought. They built the playground and the gymnasium. And during the school hours, that street that actually went through that separated the two properties was blocked off by these big orange cones. But after 3 o'clock, after school finished, the city had to take the cones away, and the street was just open. And many people, it was amazing, after all those years of that parish being there, many people had no idea that there was a school there, and the kids that would run across the street. Well, the kids are so used to running across the street, they didn't even think about it. So every first week of school, at the beginning of the school year, we'd march all the kids out, because our daycare started at 3 o'clock, it ended at 6. So the cones were gone by the time we got there. And we'd line up the kids along the curb like this, okay? And we'd say, what do you guys see? "Oh, there's no cones." "Yeah, okay, there's no cones." "What happens when there's no cones?" "Cars drive by." "Okay, cars drive by, great." So here's the deal. One of the sisters will always walk into the street before you, and they will look both ways just to make sure, even if you think you don't see any cars, the sisters are going to go before you to make sure that there are no cars, okay? Okay. So you know what's going to happen, though, if you ever run across the street in front of us? You're going to lose your recess. You're going to have to go back inside. Oh, yeah, we're serious, man. We don't mess around. "Okay, sister, okay." So for the first week of school, we'd all march, but the older kids like, "This is so dumb, sister." I'm like, "Just do it, get on the line, okay?" So we'd all get on the curb, and we look both ways, and the kids would cross the street. Well, inevitably, at some point in the late fall, there's like the swings and the gymnasium and the ball, and they're like, kids just kind of freak out. And after a while, they're like, ball swing, and they just take off the road in front of you. And if you've ever had a little kid run in front of you across the street, it stops your heart. And you're like, oh. Bring the kid back to the curb. What happened? "Oh, I ran across the street." Yeah, you did. What happens when you run across the street? You get run over. Yeah, that's what happens. Okay, so here's the deal. Remember we talked about this, that your choices have consequences. So we talked about that if you ever run across the street in front of us, you're gonna lose your recess. You're gonna have to go back inside. Oh, and then it is meltdown city. "I'm the meanest person ever in the history of the world. I can't believe it. Sister, I hate you. You're so mean." Take the ball, kick it across, it kicks it off the side of the school and stop. "I'm never coming back here. I'm never coming to this daycare again. See you tomorrow. Tell your mom I said hi. All right? See you later, okay?" Or, if you've ever watched little kids, they do this. "You're not the boss of me. Don't tell me what to do." "Actually, I am, so get your crayons and go back inside, okay?" So get your stuff and go. But you know what? How often... Don't be coming to our daycare, No, let me ask you this. I love those kids. Am I the meanest person ever on the face of the earth? Do I hate them because I don't want them to run across the street in front of me? No. I love those kids. Some of them are in college now. And I tell you, out of all the years that I was there, by the grace of God, nothing happened to those children. Had any of them ever been hit by a car or something would have happened, I would have died. I set up rules for them because I know what will make them happy. Because as an adult, I have the foresight to look both ways across the street, so to speak, and to make sure they're safe. I'm creating a place where they can be free, where they can thrive. But how often in our life, I mean, little kids remind me so much of myself, how often in our lives do we kind of stand in the street, so to speak, of life, and we shake our fist at God saying, you're not the boss of me, don't tell me what to do. Because we don't get it. Maybe our image of God is like what you've heard. Maybe we have an image of God as a God who's vindictive or vicious, or somebody who just wants to suck the fun out of everything. We don't understand that we have a God who loves us, and who doesn't just stand on the side of the road and call out to us to come home, but who gets into the street and bears our pain. If you've ever been a little kid, maybe when you were little, if you have a little brother or sister, you know that some kids have a little habit sometimes of what they do is they have security blankets. You ever have a security blanket as a kid? All right, okay. Or maybe you have a little special teddy bear. And sometimes what happens is we didn't usually let the kids take them outside because they get it dirty. But sometimes the kids were so attached to their teddy bear, their security blanket, they would not leave without them. So what they would do is they'd put on their blanket and they'd just, walk out to the playground. But it's kind of hard to play on the swings when you have both hands full, right? So what they would do is they'd come and sit with us boring nuns because they couldn't play on the swings. They couldn't play because they didn't want to let go of their security blanket. And they sat next to us and be like, don't you want to go and play? No, it's all right. And you watch them, and their life is being muted because they don't want to let go of something. And security blankets, after a while, kids oftentimes think they have magical powers, like, I'm invisible, you can't see me. I can totally see you. No, you can't. Okay, I can see you. And they hold them tight, and after a while, they kind of smell. Have you ever tried to wash a kid's security blanket? They'll bite your hand off before they separate you from it, right? And they sit there, and they hunker down in life, and they start to miss out on what's most beautiful. This Lent, what God did, because he loves me, is he started to show me my security blankets. What separates me from the limitless love of God. What I hide behind because I'm afraid. What I cling to because I think it gives me, so to speak, powers. Where I can't be hurt, I'm not going to be vulnerable, I'm not going to let anybody see who I am. And I'm just going to hide. And security blankets change, I think, over the years, I know for a long time I had security blankets of addiction. I had a lot of brokenness in my life. And for a long time, I was just embarrassed about how I came into the world. I was conceived out of wedlock. My biological parents were 17. They're in grade 12. Obviously not married and probably doing something they shouldn't have been doing, and I was the result of their union. And to this day, I don't know my biological parents, but I do have a deep intuition that at some point my mother thought of aborting me, but she didn't. And I sit here before you tonight because a scared 17-year-old girl said yes to life, and I was the child in her womb. I was adopted when I was 3 months old, and by parents who loved me very much. But when I heard about the story that I was adopted, something in me happened. I thought maybe there was something wrong with me. Like, what would be so wrong with me that my own mother wouldn't want me, right? And as an adult now, I understand the ramifications. I look at 17-year-old girls, and I'm like, oh my gosh. But as a little girl, I couldn't understand that. And I was telling the ladies that early this morning that when I was 10 years old, I had my innocence taken from me. And I didn't tell anybody. And I found that one of the ways that I would forget about it is I would start to drink. I started drinking when I was 12. And when I was 13 years old, I had my innocence completely taken from me by an older boy. And I didn't tell anybody. And my life shattered. And I thought, you know what, I was, love volleyball, I love school, and I thought if I was just good enough, you wouldn't notice. And so I played Division I college volleyball, and I wanted to work for ESPN, and I had this whole dream and goal in my life. But the truth was, by the time I was 21, I was already an alcoholic. And I was addicted to lust. I was very promiscuous. My life was a mess. And you talk about self-hatred. And that's what addiction does. I remember when I woke up one morning, and I've had a lot of bottoms. We hit bottom. We talk about hitting bottom as addicts. And I've had a lot of hitting bottoms in my life. But one in particular changed my life. And I was 21 years old, and I woke up, and I remembered two things. Number one, I remembered what I had done the night before, which didn't always happen because I was having blackouts. So if you're drinking and having blackouts, that's a problem drinking. You're probably an addict. But I remembered what I had done the night before, and it was awful. But I think what caused me the most shame was that I'd promised myself that I wasn't going to do it anymore. And I meant it. And you mean it, don't you? If you're addicted to porn or masturbation or anger or cutting or food or your cell phone, whatever it is for you, we mean it, don't it? We mean it. We say, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to do it. And we put it aside and we turn the computer off or we close the fridge door and we say, I'm not going to do it. I mean it. But see, the problem is addiction seeks to medicate a deeper pain, and I was in a lot of pain. And so our pain doesn't go away, it just comes back to the surface. And what we do is we go back to our addiction. The cycle of shame just goes on and on and on and on and on. And that's where I found myself that morning. So disgusted with myself, so full of shame, and I'm sure some of you know what that's like. And I got up, and I'm a big girl, right? But I curled up in a tiny little ball on the floor of my room, and I just wished for death because I didn't know what to do. I was so sick, and nobody knew. So isolated. And I was just longing for something more in my life. Like, how could you just be yourself? Could you just be comfortable in who you are? Could you just sit and just be at peace and not have to pretend? All of us have security blankets, whether it's, I'm so cool, or we hide behind our intellect, or we hide behind popularity. We're so funny like that because we're so terrified of being stripped naked and just being ourselves. But what if there was a life really free like that? I want to show you a commercial. It's kind of self-explanatory, but what you're going to see is two groups of people. You're going to see a group of adults, and they're going to be asked one question. And then you're going to see a group of kids, and they're going to be asked the exact same question, but they're going to give two totally different answers. Can you show the video for us?
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for having me. All right, let's do this.
Team Fever, take one. Mark?
So we've got one question that we want to ask you today.
Okay, well, what's that question?
The question is, if you could change one thing about your body, what would it be?
Only one.
I would change my forehead. I have a really big forehead.
I'd like to be taller.
The puffiness of my face.
My ears. I have big ears.
Stretch marks after having a baby.
A lot of times, kids would make fun of me, hey man, you got big ears, you got Dumbo over there,
Definitely my skin, because I've dealt with acne and eczema issues ever since I was a little kid.
我小时候，因为大家比较喜欢大眼睛的那种美女，所以我就也希望自己眼睛能大一些。
Growing up, a lot of people call me five head, or your forehead's so big. They've always would say something to me about it.
Yo diría porque muchos dos caminan derecho y como que mi pie está un poco chueco. When I was younger, I felt like I wasn't quite adequate enough.
Can you sit on the chair? All right, I'm going to ask you one question.
What's the question?
If you could change one thing about your body, what would you change?
Have a mermaid tail.
Probably a sharp mouth. That could eat a lot of stuff.
I could have teleportation in my body. Extra pointy ears. I want legs like a cheetah so I can run faster like a cheetah. I could have wings so I could fly. I don't think there's anything to change. I like my body actually.
Yeah, you wouldn't change anything?
Nothing else. Just a mermaid tail.
Interesting question, yes? The adults answered it from a very different perspective. And you hear them talking about some deep stuff and some superficial stuff, but you hear them talking about stuff that happened when they were kids. The guy's like, hey man, when I was a kid, people make fun of my ears. And then I think the woman at the end, as a lot of adults in us in this room know, she sums it up quite nicely when she says, when I was younger, I didn't feel quite adequate enough. And then you see the children. And one of them's so little she can't even get on the stool. And one of them wants legs like a cheetah so he can run faster like a cheetah. And my favorite one is a little girl who says, I wish I had wings so I could fly. The adults relating out of their woundedness, out of fear. But the children relate a bit differently. They actually relate out of here. All right. So they're free. They live out of their identity as beloved child of God. And they see the world not as in our brokenness, but in their dreams and their desires and what they authentically desire to be. And there's a reason why Jesus tells us not to be childish, but to be childlike. Or we don't have to put on a security blanket to be liked or to make us invisible or pretend that we're something that we're not, but that we can live in freedom. Jesus has a funny way of always setting people free. If you read the story in the Gospel of Luke, you know that there's some people crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus is being reviled the whole time. He's being cursed at. He's being spit on. And one of the men hanging there with him says, "Man, are you the Son of God? If you're really the Son of God, save yourself and save us. Come on, man, show up." And the other criminal says, "Have you no fear of God? We're getting what we deserve because we deserve this punishment. We're getting our just rewards because we've done something wrong, but this man is innocent. He has done nothing." And the criminal looks at Jesus and he says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Christ so tenderly looks at him like he looks at us, my dear brothers and sisters. Out of all the fears we have, all the fears we have of being stripped naked, all the fears we have of telling our story, all the fears we have of our addiction and our secrets, all the stuff we cling so tightly to just to be loved, he's not deterred by any of it. And he looks deeply into that man's eyes and he says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." A confession from a criminal who thought his life was lost. I don't know what your security blankets are. I don't know. I don't know what your trauma is. I don't know what your dreams are, what your desires are. But I do know that this man loves you limitlessly. And he's not deterred by anything we might put in the way. This is a very poor and powerless position to be in, isn't it? With your arms nailed to the cross and literally stripped naked. That's what the Romans did to you, just to make sure you had no decency left. But Christ hangs there as the bridegroom who's going to give his life for his bride so she can live. He's going to come and visit us tonight. And my invitation to all of us, really myself included, is, I don't know what security blanket you're clinging to most tightly to, where you're just afraid. And maybe it's something really dark. Maybe it's something you've never told anybody. I would just invite you, could you give that to him? Could you just surrender and open your hands and say yes? Just a little yes. Nothing heroic yet. But I think saying yes to the things is heroic indeed.